In Company of Heroes, infantry-based anti-tank weapons that can deal engine damage to vehicles are commonly referred to as snares. And how these weapons, such as anti-tank grenades and panzerfausts, work have changed in several ways when going from COH2 to COH3. In this video, we will be exploring snare stats and mechanics so you can use them like a pro. Starting at the beginning with how a snare functions. After the damage from the snaring weapon has been applied to a vehicle, if the vehicle health has been reduced to a certain percentage of its maximum health, it will get engine damage, which will last until the vehicle has been repaired. Negative effects on a unit, such as engine damage, are commonly called criticals in Company of Heroes. This covers both temporary and permanent debuffs, so you may hear engine damage referred to as an engine crit. The health threshold for engine damage from a snare is 75% in Company of Heroes 2. But in COH3, the vehicle has to be below 50% health. Exactly 50% isn't enough for a crit, as we can see if we use a 120 damage panzerfaust against a 240 health vehicle. However, to compensate for this harder to reach lowered threshold in COH3, if the snare does not cause engine damage, it will temporarily crew shock the vehicle. And if the vehicle takes another snare while it is crew shocked, it will become engine damaged, even if its health hasn't dipped below 50%. To remove engine damage, you need to repair the vehicle to 90% health in COH3. Whereas in COH2, it was over 75% health for engine damage caused by a snare, but all the way to 100% health for engine damage caused by a mine, in spite of them using the exact same icon, which is confusing. Up till this point, I prefer the snaring system of COH3 over COH2. Now, here are the effects of engine damage on a vehicle. In both games, they are the same, minus 60% to speed and minus 40% to rotation rate. However, in COH3, there is a new movement stat called pivot rate. This is how fast the vehicle can turn while staying in the same spot. In COH2, pivoting is covered by the rotation rate. The important part is that a vehicle's pivot rate in COH3 is not altered by engine damage, meaning an engine damaged vehicle can spin on the spot just as quickly as an undamaged one. Whereas in COH2, the engine damaged vehicle would turn on the spot 40% slower. This change blunts the impact of engine damage on vehicles that have no turret in COH3, since they can just stay on the same spot and pivot, which makes flanking more difficult. Also, pivoting like this makes it easier to keep the frontal armor of a damaged vehicle facing the correct direction against enemies that are attacking from an angle. My first impression of pivoting being unaltered by engine damage is that I don't like it, and that it reduces the need for good vehicle positioning. However, because so many vehicles are so fast in COH3 and have speed boosting abilities stacked on top of that, perhaps gameplay would overall be worse if pivot rate was also reduced by engine damage. Crew shock from a snare lasts for 5 seconds. Its effects are minus 60% to speed, minus 60% to rotation rate, and minus 80% to acceleration. Also note that if you snare a vehicle that has crew shock from a different source, like the M2A1 howitzer charged shells, this does not cause engine damage. And if you use a snare against a vehicle that is already engine damaged, in spite of it saying crew shock here, it does not suffer any further speed penalties. Now let's talk the damage of snares. In COH2, every snare does 100 damage except sticky satchels, which are 240 damage. Whereas in COH3, most AT nades are 110 damage, but the coastal OTO is only 80 and the panzerfaust is 120. Sticky satchels remain at 240 damage in COH3. When it comes to penetration, every snare in COH3 has 1000 penetration, so they will always do full damage against any vehicle, whereas in COH3, snares ranged from 100 to 160 penetration, but generally did 80% damage when they bounced. So this chance to bounce usually only impacted gameplay in very annoying fringe scenarios. I prefer the reliable penetration behavior of snares in COH3. Now let's look at the maximum range on snares. In COH2, most were 15 range, with the Grenadier Panzerfaust being the longest at 19.26 when you included the 7% range bulletin. In COH3, all snares are 15 range except the Panzerfaust, which is 18 range on Grenadiers and 20 range on Fallschirmjäger. I feel that a squad with strong camouflage should not have the longest range snare. Not to mention, due to the 25% damage bonus when attacking from camouflage, the Fallschirmjäger Faust can end up dealing 150 damage. Sticky satchels are the exception, having 10 range in both games. So overall, the max range of snares are very similar in both games, but how snares function has been altered significantly in COH3, which massively reduces their effective range. In COH2, if you activate a snare on a vehicle that is within range, it doesn't matter how far away it drives after the activation, the snare will eventually connect. Whereas in COH3, it seems the vehicle has to remain in range until almost all of the snaring animation is complete, which is just before the projectile is airborne. Otherwise, the snare gets cancelled. This makes it much harder to get snares off in COH3 and is the most important difference between the two games. Combine that with the buffs to acceleration from a standstill vehicles recently received, and the ballistic top speed of some of the light vehicles in COH3, it makes it very hard to land a snare on a good opponent. Also, due to the slow projectile speed of anti-tank grenades, there are sometimes comical moments where the ultralight vehicle is halfway across the map by the time the engine damage occurs, putting it safely out of reach of a chase down. I tested the amount of time between activating a snare and it dealing damage to a vehicle at max range. Thrown AT nades in COH3 seem to be the same, taking around 3.8 seconds. However, the Wehrmacht snares are different. Panzerfausts are much faster at 2.3 seconds, and the Coastal Reserve's OTO has 2.44. This is because they both explode immediately upon impact, whereas the other AT nades have around 1.3 seconds of fuse time after landing on their target. In COH2, the startup animation times varied by a lot more, but everything except the satchel did damage immediately upon impact. The Coastal Auto also has other unique properties. It is thrown overhand, unlike all the other anti-tank grenades which are thrown underhand. The overhand throwing animation is around 110 milliseconds faster. This makes the Auto slightly harder to dodge by driving out of range. It also blinds the enemy vehicle and disables the guns on it for 5 seconds. However, don't be fooled by the flames it leaves on the ground. They do no damage to infantry standing on top of them. I have heard a myth going around that when the snaring model dies in COH3, the snare gets cancelled. This is not the case. A new model will take over the snare. However, this extra delay may allow the vehicle to get out of range, which then prevents the snare from going off. But in my testing of that scenario, I stumbled onto some interesting behavior. The highest health model, which is in range of the vehicle, is always the one to initiate the snare. You can see that as I change the health of each model without changing their position, the highest health model of the squad is always the one to initiate the Panzerfaust. This sounds good in theory because the model will hopefully survive long enough to execute the command. But in practice, since snares are so frequently cancelled by driving out of range, perhaps instead it should be the model that is closest to the vehicle that initiates the snare. Or maybe some combination, like the closest model that is above 20% health. I think this change would allow snares to work on moving vehicles more often. Also, if a model has an anti-tank slot weapon like a bazooka, maybe they should have a lower priority for throwing the snare so you don't interrupt them from doing damage with that valuable weapon. Snares also seem to be afflicted by a few bugs that make them less reliable in COH3. When a vehicle drives into and pushes the model that is doing the snaring animation, the snare gets cancelled, and the squad does not try to reinitiate it. This badly needs to be fixed, because this is a very common occurrence when a vehicle is driving past an enemy squad, and a huge source of frustration. In COH2, snare cooldowns vary quite a lot from 15 to 30 seconds. All snares in COH3 have a 30-second cooldown except the British infantry section, which is 15 seconds. But that brings me on to veterancy. In COH2, quite a lot of squads gained a buff to their snare from veterancy bonuses, such as longer range or faster cooldown. As far as I could tell, no squads get a veterancy bonus to their snares in COH3. Perhaps this could be an avenue to explore to help balance certain faction or unit weaknesses in the mid to late game. In COH2, certain snares like the panzerfaust or Rifleman 18-8 could be used against enemy buildings like resource caches and bunkers for a small and costly burst of damage. However, in COH3, no snares can be used against buildings. Considering the rise of bunker spam from the new Italian coastal battle group, perhaps some snares should gain the ability to be used against buildings to help counteract this. Now for a word about snare hotkeys. Almost every snare is positioned here, on X using the standard grid key layout with a US keyboard. However, the Italian coastal OTO and Bazooka Team Sticky Satchel have been moved here to Z. I think these kind of hotkey divergences should be avoided at all costs. I cannot stress this enough. If possible, the same function should be on the same hotkey for every unit. It makes switching between factions and build orders much more fluid. Please move them to X. I disliked that for COH2 1v1, basically every competitive build order involved making 3 to 4 mainline squads with relatively few specialists or elites. And a large part of that was the power of the snares that the mainlines wielded. This crowded out producing other squads and hurt build order diversity. This is where COH3 is superior. Early build orders tend to be much more diverse, getting away from every faction massing units with snares. And a lot of this is possible due to a wider array of anti-tank options being available in the early game within each base faction. But I think there is still plenty of room to improve snares in COH3 without them becoming overwhelmingly good. Hopefully this video highlights to Relic the areas they need to address, and I hope you all learned something too. If you want to see more videos like this, I hope you consider coming on board as a Patreon backer.